Imagine a world where two superpowers decide with a single line on a map to divide the entire planet between themselves. And no, we're not talking about some grand strategy game or science fiction scenario. This was a real agreement that changed the course of history. In 1494, Portugal and Spain signed a secret treaty that redefined the future of the Americas, Africa, and Asia. But what was really at stake in this division, and how did it affect millions of people around the globe? The Treaty of Tordesillas was an agreement forged between the two greatest empires of the time, Portugal and Spain, to prevent conflicts over newly discovered lands. With the Pope's blessing, they drew an imaginary line across the Atlantic Ocean, splitting the world into two parts, one for each empire. But what appeared to be a diplomatic solution actually concealed boundless ambitions, political intrigue, and consequences that echo to this very day. Consider this. With a stroke of a pen, these European powers claimed ownership of lands they hadn't even discovered yet, territories where millions of people already lived, with their own cultures, languages, and ways of life. This wasn't simply a matter of drawing borders, it was the beginning of a new world order that would reshape human history forever. What's particularly fascinating is how these two relatively small European nations, sitting at the edge of the continent, managed to claim such vast territories across multiple continents. Portugal, a country smaller than many modern US states, ended up controlling Brazil, parts of Africa, and territories stretching all the way to Asia. Spain, while larger, similarly claimed dominion over most of South America, Central America, parts of North America, and territories in the Pacific. Behind closed doors, monarchs, explorers, and papal representatives engaged in intense negotiations that would determine the fate of continents. The stakes couldn't have been higher: control of trade routes, access to precious metals, spices, and the opportunity to spread Christianity to new lands. If you love history and want to unravel the mysteries of these great empires, like this video, subscribe to the Modern Age Chronicles channel and don't miss a single episode. Join us as we explore how a single line drawn across a map changed the world forever, setting in motion centuries of colonization, cultural exchange, conflict, and transformation that continues to shape our modern world. Let's journey back to a small Spanish town on the 7th of June, 1494. In Tordesillas, representatives of two powerful kingdoms gathered to sign what would become one of history's most audacious documents. The Treaty of Tordesillas wasn't just a simple border agreement. It was an attempt to split the entire world in half. Picture this: an imaginary line drawn 370 leagues west of the Cape Verde Islands, a measurement roughly equivalent to 1,200 miles. Everything east of this invisible boundary would belong to Portugal, while everything west would fall under Spanish control. With this single stroke, two European powers claimed ownership of territories they hadn't even seen yet, lands they could barely imagine. But this dramatic division didn't happen overnight. Behind this agreement lay months of intense diplomatic negotiations, threats of war, and political maneuvering that would make modern politicians blush. What many people don't realize is that this treaty was actually a revision of an earlier agreement. Just 1 year before, in 1493, Pope Alexander VI had issued a papal bull called Inter Caetera, which drew a line much more favorable to Spain, about 100 leagues west of the Azores. The Portuguese King John II, known as a brilliant strategist, was furious with this arrangement. He immediately dispatched ambassadors to the Spanish court to demand renegotiation, hinting that naval conflict might follow if adjustments weren't made. Why was Portugal so determined to push this line farther west? The answer lies in the spice trade. Portugal had been investing in finding a sea route to India for decades, pouring vast resources into navigational technology and exploration along Africa's coast. Control of this route would mean access to pepper, cinnamon, cloves, and other spices. that were literally worth their weight in gold in European markets. Portuguese navigators had already mapped much of Africa's coastline, and they suspected that pushing the boundary westward would give them more maneuvering room for their planned voyages around Africa to reach the Indies. Spain, meanwhile, was focused on the promise of gold, silver, and new territories in the west, following Columbus's recent voyage in 1492. The Spanish monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella, fresh from completing the Reconquista and expelling the Moors from Granada, were eager to build their empire across the Atlantic. What's fascinating is that both parties were making claims on a world they didn't fully understand. When these negotiations were taking place, Columbus had only recently returned from his first voyage, believing he had reached Asia. Neither Spain nor Portugal had any idea of the true size of the Americas, the Pacific Ocean, or the actual circumference of the Earth. They were essentially dividing up a map with enormous blank spaces marked terra incognita, unknown land. The agreement was sealed not just with royal signatures, but with the blessing of Pope Alexander VI, a Spaniard-born Rodrigo Borgia, who had his own political reasons for mediating this division. By authorizing this split, the Pope reinforced the Church's role as the supreme authority in international matters, while also supporting his native Spain's ambitions. In one of history's great ironies, neither party could have predicted that this line would eventually give Portugal control of Brazil, a massive territory in South America that technically fell on the Portuguese side of the line. When Pedro Álvares Cabral officially discovered Brazil in 1500, it was almost by accident, as his fleet swung far west into the Atlantic to catch favorable winds on their journey to India. This accidental discovery would give Portugal its largest and most profitable colony. The Treaty of Tordesillas wasn't just lines on parchment. It was the beginning of a global power struggle that would shape continents, create and destroy empires, and fundamentally alter the course of human history. Every great historical drama needs its cast of characters, and the Treaty of Tordesillas featured some of the most fascinating figures of the Renaissance era. Behind this world-changing agreement stood three major powers: the shrewd Portuguese king, the ambitious Spanish monarchs, and a calculating pope with his own agenda. Let's start with King John II of Portugal, known to history as the Perfect Prince. This wasn't just a flattering nickname. John earned this title through his remarkable political acumen and vision for Portuguese expansion. When he ascended to the throne in 1481, he immediately set about strengthening royal power, sometimes through ruthless means. He personally stabbed to death his most powerful noble opponent, the Duke of Braganza, and ordered the execution of many others who challenged his authority. But John's true genius lay in his understanding of geography and navigation. While other European monarchs were fighting petty wars for small territories, John was systematically investing in what we might call today research and development. He assembled Europe's finest astronomers, cartographers, and navigators in his court, creating what was essentially the NASA of the 15th century. Under his patronage, Portuguese sailors developed new ships called caravels, perfected the use of the compass and astrolabe, and slowly mapped Africa's coastline. What's particularly fascinating about John is that he nearly beat Columbus to the punch. When Columbus first approached the Portuguese court with his plan to reach Asia by sailing west, John's experts evaluated the proposal. They correctly calculated that Columbus had drastically underestimated the Earth's circumference, concluding the journey would be too long and dangerous. John rejected Columbus's proposal, not because he lacked vision, but because his scientists were actually right. The Americas weren't on anyone's map yet, and without this unexpected landmass, Columbus's ships would have run out of supplies long before reaching Asia. On the Spanish side stood the formidable Catholic monarchs, Queen Isabella of Castile and King Ferdinand of Aragon. Their marriage in 1469 had united the two largest kingdoms of the Iberian Peninsula, creating the foundation of modern Spain. By 1494, they were at the height of their power, having just completed the Reconquista, the centuries-long campaign to reclaim the Iberian Peninsula from Muslim rule with the conquest of Granada in 1492. Isabella, in particular, was a force to be reckoned with. Deeply religious, but also pragmatic, she took the gamble on Columbus after Portugal refused him. While Ferdinand was often occupied with military campaigns, Isabella was crafting a centralized Spanish state through administrative reforms, religious policy, and strategic marriages for her children, including Catherine of Aragon, who would later become the first wife of Henry VIII of England. Ferdinand was the military strategist of the pair, known for his cunning and willingness to break promises when politically expedient. Niccolo Machiavelli would later cite Ferdinand as a model prince who knew when to abandon alliances for the good of the state. Together, these monarchs created the Spanish Inquisition, expelled Jews and Muslims from Spain, and laid the groundwork for what would soon become the most powerful empire in the world. But perhaps the most intriguing player in this global chess game was Pope Alexander VI, born Rodrigo Borgia in Valencia, Spain. Even by the standards of Renaissance papacy, Alexander was exceptionally worldly and corrupt. He had numerous children whom he openly acknowledged and worked tirelessly to provide with wealth, titles, and power. His son Cesare and daughter Lucrecia Borgia would become infamous in their own right. Alexander's Spanish origins heavily influenced his mediation of the treaty. His initial papal bulls clearly favored Spain, drawing the dividing line much farther east than the final treaty. Only after intense Portuguese pressure did he agree to the compromise at Tordesillas. The Pope had multiple motivations for involving himself in this global division. First, it reinforced papal authority as the ultimate arbiter in international disputes. Second, it ensured that both Spain and Portugal would spread Catholicism in their new territories, expanding the Church's reach. And third, it created obligations from both powers toward the papacy, which Alexander and his family could leverage for financial and political gain. What makes these three powers so remarkable is that they were essentially gambling on unknown factors. None of them had accurate maps of the world they were dividing. They were making claims on territories they couldn't see, couldn't measure, and couldn't even reach yet. It was geopolitical poker on a global scale, with the future of continents at stake. The Treaty of Tordesillas might have looked like a diplomatic masterpiece on parchment, but in practice it was a powder keg waiting to explode. What seemed like a neat solution to divide the world between two powers quickly unraveled into centuries of conflict, territorial disputes, and geopolitical chaos. Let's start with the most obvious problem. How exactly do you enforce an imaginary line running through the middle of the Atlantic Ocean? In the late 15th century, determining longitude accurately was virtually impossible. The technology simply didn't exist. Navigators could measure latitude reasonably well by observing the stars, but longitude remained a mystery that wouldn't be solved until the 18th century with the invention of reliable marine chronometers. This meant that Portuguese and Spanish captains often had no idea whether they were trespassing into each other's territories. Imagine sailing across the Atlantic, thousands of miles from home, with only the stars and rudimentary instruments to guide you, trying to determine if you were on the right side of an invisible line. It was a recipe for constant disputes and accusations of boundary violations. The Portuguese, for instance, almost certainly knew they were pushing the boundaries when they ventured further west into what is now Brazil. By 1514, Portuguese explorers had pushed nearly 200 leagues beyond what many cartographers believed was the treaty line. The Spanish complained bitterly, but by then, Portugal had established fortified settlements along the Brazilian coast and wasn't about to give them up. Meanwhile, in Asia, the situation became even more complicated. The treaty had extended the line of demarcation around the globe, but no one had accurately calculated the Earth's circumference. When Portuguese explorers reached the Moluccas, the famed Spice Islands in present-day Indonesia, Spain claimed these valuable islands fell within their hemisphere. This sparked the Spice Islands controversy, a heated diplomatic battle that wouldn't be resolved until 1529 with the Treaty of Zaragoza, where Portugal essentially paid Spain to relinquish their claims. But perhaps the biggest challenge to the Treaty of Tordesillas came from powers who were never party to it in the first place. France, England, and later the Netherlands had no intention of respecting a world divided solely between Spain and Portugal. The French King Francis I famously quipped, "Show me the clause in Adam's will that excludes me from a share of the world." In other words, by what right did Spain and Portugal claim everything? The French began sending expeditions to North America by 1524, establishing fishing outposts and fur trading stations in territories clearly assigned to Spain. The English followed suit under Elizabeth I, with explorers like Francis Drake not only mapping Spanish-claimed territories, but actively raiding Spanish settlements and treasure ships. By the 17th century, the Dutch had established their own East India Company, directly challenging Portuguese dominance in the spice trade. The Dutch seized Portuguese forts in Asia, established colonies in the Americas, and became a major colonial power, despite the treaty's provisions. One of the most fascinating cases of treaty violation came from Spain itself. As the Spanish Empire expanded westward across the Pacific, they eventually reached the Philippines in 1565. The problem: the Philippines technically fell on the Portuguese side of the global line, but Spain claimed them anyway, arguing that since they had approached from the east rather than sailing around Africa, they hadn't violated the treaty. It was a legal fiction that everyone recognized as nonsense, but Spain was powerful enough to make it stick. Indigenous peoples across the Americas, Africa, and Asia found themselves caught in the middle of these European power struggles. The treaty had casually divided their homelands without any consideration of existing civilizations, kingdoms, or tribal territories. For them, the treaty wasn't just imprecise. It was an alien concept, the idea that distant European monarchs could claim sovereignty over lands they had never even seen. The Inca Empire, the Aztec civilization, the kingdoms of the Congo and Angola, and countless other indigenous societies suddenly found themselves assigned to either Spain or Portugal based on their location relative to an arbitrary line. Their resistance to European colonization was fierce in many cases, but the technological advantages of the Europeans, combined with devastating diseases that wiped out large portions of native populations, eventually led to European domination across much of the globe. By the 18th century, the Treaty of Tordesillas had essentially become a historical curiosity rather than an enforceable agreement. The world had grown far more complex, with multiple colonial powers carving out empires across every continent. But the legacy of this audacious attempt to split the world in two lives in national boundaries, language distributions, and cultural patterns that persist to this day. So did you know that the Treaty of Tordesillas remains so controversial that historians still debate its consequences today? If you're enjoying this deep dive into one of history's most audacious agreements, hit that like button, share this video, and subscribe to the Modern Age Chronicles channel for more incredible historical stories. And tell us in the comments, do you think the world would be different if this treaty had never existed? Would colonial history have taken another path? Would the languages and cultures of the Americas be distributed differently? Share your thoughts below, and let's continue this fascinating historical conversation together. One of history's greatest ironies is that Brazil, the largest country in South America, and once the jewel of Portugal's empire, came into Portuguese possession almost by accident. In the year 1500, Just 6 years after the Treaty of Tordesillas was signed, Portuguese captain Pedro Álvares Cabral was leading a fleet of 13 ships bound for India. His mission was straightforward: follow Vasco da Gama's recently established route around Africa to reach the valuable spice markets of Calicut. But here's where the story gets fascinating. Cabral's fleet deliberately swung far west into the Atlantic Ocean, much farther than would seem necessary for a journey around Africa. Why would they do this? Portuguese navigators had discovered that by sailing westward into the Atlantic, they could catch favorable winds and currents that would ultimately help propel them around the southern tip of Africa. It was essentially the nautical equivalent of a slingshot maneuver. On April 22, 1500, Cabral's lookout spotted land, a large mountainous coastline that wasn't on any of their charts. They had stumbled upon what we now know as Brazil. Cabral initially named it the Land of the True Cross, though Portuguese sailors soon began calling it Land of Brazil, after a valuable red dye wood found there that resembled the color of glowing embers, or brasas in Portuguese. What makes this discovery so remarkable is that many historians today believe it wasn't accidental at all. There's compelling evidence suggesting that Portuguese navigators already suspected there was land in this region of the Atlantic. Remember King John II, the perfect prince we talked about earlier? His systematic approach to exploration included gathering intelligence from other sailors and fishermen. Some scholars believe Portuguese fishermen may have already encountered Brazil's coastline while chasing schools of cod, but kept their discovery secret to protect their fishing grounds. Furthermore, the Treaty of Tordesillas had pushed the dividing line far enough west that Portugal gained rights to a slice of eastern South America, a seemingly odd demand if they had no idea land existed there. It's entirely possible that Cabral's accidental discovery was actually a carefully planned expedition to claim territory that Portuguese navigators already suspected was there. Either way, this accident secured for Portugal an enormous landmass rich in resources. Brazil would eventually become Portugal's largest and most profitable colony, producing sugar, gold, diamonds, coffee, and many other valuable commodities. Without Brazil, Portugal might have remained a minor colonial power focused mainly on trading posts in Africa and Asia, rather than becoming a major player in the Americas. The Treaty of Tordesillas wasn't just about geography, it was deeply rooted in the medieval worldview that was just beginning to crumble in the face of Renaissance thinking. Contrary to popular belief, educated people in the 15th century didn't actually believe the earth was flat. That's a myth that emerged much later. Most scholars, navigators, and rulers knew perfectly well that the world was round. What they disagreed about was its size. Columbus famously underestimated the Earth's circumference by about 25%, which is why he believed he could reach Asia by sailing west. Portuguese experts were much closer to the correct measurements, which is partly why King John rejected Columbus's proposal. His calculations showed the journey would be too long for ships to carry sufficient supplies. However, the Treaty of Tordesillas was infused with medieval concepts about the unknown. Medieval maps often featured illustrations of sea monsters, strange beasts, and mythical kingdoms in unexplored regions. The phrase, "Here be dragons," captures this mixture of fear and fascination with the unknown. These beliefs weren't just superstition, they shaped policy. Spain and Portugal genuinely believed they would find the kingdom of Prester John, a legendary Christian ruler said to preside over a wealthy realm somewhere in Africa or Asia. Finding and allying with this mythical king was actually listed as an objective in several Portuguese royal directives to explorers. Another fascinating aspect of the treaty was how it handled the spiritual dimension of colonization. The document explicitly tasked both kingdoms with converting indigenous peoples to Christianity. This wasn't just a side note, it was considered a sacred duty and a primary justification for claiming these lands in the first place. Pope Alexander's bulls emphasized that spreading Christianity was the principal purpose behind European expansion, even though economic motives were obviously paramount. This religious dimension created an unusual situation where missionaries sometimes became the fiercest critics of colonial abuses. Dominican friar Bartolomé de las Casas famously documented and condemned Spanish atrocities against indigenous peoples in the Americas, creating internal tensions within the Spanish Empire about how colonization should proceed. Perhaps the most surprising aspect of the Treaty of Tordesillas is how long it remained relevant. Although frequently violated and increasingly ignored by other European powers, the basic Portugal East, Spain West division shaped colonial policy for centuries. When Brazil declared independence from Portugal in 1822, it largely maintained the borders established as a result of the treaty, which is why Brazilians speak Portuguese, while most of their South American neighbors speak Spanish. So a single line drawn on a map in 1494 continues to influence language, culture, and politics across entire continents even today, making the Treaty of Tordesillas one of history's most consequential documents. Few documents in history have shaped our world as profoundly as the Treaty of Tordesillas. This agreement between two European powers reverberated across continents, transforming societies, economies, and cultures in ways that continue to define our global landscape today. The ripple effects of this single document have touched billions of lives across more than 5 centuries. Let's start with the most obvious impact: the linguistic and cultural map of the Americas. Have you ever wondered why Brazil, this massive country taking up nearly half of South America, speaks Portuguese while its neighbors speak Spanish? The answer lies directly in the Treaty of Tordesillas. That imaginary line slicing through the Atlantic gave Portugal claim to Brazil's eastern bulge, while Spain received rights to most of the continent. Today, approximately 215 million Brazilians speak Portuguese, making it the most widely spoken language in South America, despite being surrounded by Spanish-speaking nations. This linguistic island is a direct legacy of that 15th century agreement. The cultural implications go far beyond language alone. Portuguese colonization brought distinctive architectural styles, religious practices, musical traditions, and culinary influences that made Brazilian culture noticeably different from its Spanish-influenced neighbors. The vibrant celebration of Carnival, the syncretic religious practices blending Catholicism with African traditions, the distinctive sounds of bossa nova and samba, all these cultural treasures stem from Brazil's Portuguese colonial heritage, which itself traces back to that line drawn at Tordesillas. In Asia, the consequences were equally profound, but often overlooked. The Portuguese establishment of trading posts along Africa's coast and throughout the Indian Ocean created the first truly global trade network. Cities like Goa in India, Malacca in Malaysia, and Macau in China became Portuguese enclaves, introducing European influences that persist to this day. In Macau, for instance, you can still find Portuguese street names, Catholic churches, and distinctive cuisine that fuses Chinese ingredients with Portuguese cooking techniques. The Philippines presents a fascinating case study in the treaty's global reach. Although these islands technically fell within Portugal's sphere according to the treaty, Spain claimed them after Magellan's expedition arrived there in 1521. For over 300 years, the Philippines were governed as part of Spain's American Empire, administered through Mexico rather than directly from Spain. This created a unique cultural blend of Asian, Spanish, and Mexican influences that you won't find anywhere else in Asia. Even today, Filipino cuisine, language, religion, and naming conventions show clear Spanish influences. Filipino names like Miguel, Fernando, and Maria are common throughout the islands. The treaty also reshaped global trade patterns in ways that accelerated early capitalism and wealth accumulation in Europe. By establishing monopolies over different trade routes, Portugal and Spain created enormous profit opportunities. Portuguese control of the spice trade via the route around Africa brought incredible wealth to Lisbon. At the height of the spice trade, a single successful voyage could yield profits of up to 3,000%. Similarly, Spain's monopoly on American silver transformed the global economy, flooding Europe with precious metals and fueling both inflation and economic growth. This wealth accumulation played a crucial role in funding the Renaissance and later the scientific revolution in Europe. The riches extracted from colonial territories paid for art, architecture, universities, and scientific exploration. The magnificent palaces, churches, and monuments that tourists admire in Lisbon, Madrid, and other European capitals were largely built with colonial wealth, a tangible legacy of the Treaty of Tordesillas and the colonial division it established. But we cannot speak of the treaty's consequences without acknowledging its devastating impact on indigenous peoples across multiple continents. The treaty essentially declared that non-European lands were available for claiming regardless of who already lived there. It embodied what scholars call the doctrine of discovery, the idea that European Christian nations could assert sovereignty over pagan lands upon encountering them. For the indigenous peoples of the Americas, the consequences were catastrophic. In the decades following the treaty, thriving civilizations collapsed under the twin pressures of disease and conquest. The Aztec Empire, with its magnificent capital Tenochtitlan, a city larger and cleaner than any in Europe at the time, fell to Spanish conquistadors. The Inca Empire, with its remarkable engineering achievements and complex administrative systems, was similarly dismantled. Countless smaller societies from the Amazon to the Great Lakes saw their ways of life forever altered or destroyed. In Brazil alone, the indigenous population declined from an estimated 4 to 8 million people before Portuguese contact to fewer than 200,000 by the 19th century, a demographic collapse of staggering proportions caused by disease, slavery, warfare, and displacement. African societies were also profoundly affected by the treaty's aftershocks. As plantation economies developed in Brazil and Spanish America, the demand for labor led to the transatlantic slave trade. Over 300 years, approximately 12 million Africans were forcibly transported across the Atlantic, with nearly 40% destined for Brazil. Entire regions of West and Central Africa were depopulated, political systems destabilized, and societies transformed by this massive forced migration that stemmed directly from the colonial division established at Tordesillas. Even in Asia, where European territorial control was initially limited to coastal enclaves, the arrival of Portuguese and later Spanish traders disrupted existing trade networks and power balances. Local rulers found themselves playing European powers against each other, while traditional commerce patterns that had functioned for centuries were upended by European demands and naval power. Perhaps most profoundly, the Treaty of Tordesillas helped establish a world view that divided humanity into colonizers and colonized, a perspective that would dominate global politics for centuries and whose psychological and social impacts continue to influence international relations, economic development, and cultural identity today. When we look at a modern map and see countries like Brazil, Angola, Mozambique, and East Timor united by the Portuguese language across 4 continents, or when we observe how the Spanish language stretches from Mexico to Argentina, we're seeing the linguistic footprint of this treaty. When archaeologists uncover colonial churches in Manila or Portuguese forts along the Indian Ocean coastline, they're excavating the physical remnants of the world order that Tordesillas helped create. The treaty's global consequences, linguistic, cultural, economic, political, and human, stand as a powerful reminder of how decisions made in one small Spanish town over 5 centuries ago continue to shape our world in countless ways, both visible and invisible. Today, more than 5 centuries after quills scratched parchment in that small Spanish town, the Treaty of Tordesillas stands as both a monument to human ambition and a sobering reminder of how power was wielded in the age of exploration. Its legacy is complex and contradictory, a testament to diplomatic innovation on one hand and a symbol of imperial arrogance on the other. When modern historians look back at the Treaty of Tordesillas, they often see it as the first attempt at creating an international legal framework for addressing territorial disputes. In an era when might makes right was the prevailing approach to international relations, Spain and Portugal chose negotiation over warfare, a remarkable precedent that foreshadowed modern international law. The treaty established the radical idea that territorial claims needed legal justification beyond simply planting a flag or defeating local inhabitants. Yet there's a profound irony in this legacy. The treaty that helped lay groundwork for international law was itself based on a fundamentally unjust premise, that European powers had the right to divide non-European lands without any consideration for the people already living there. The indigenous civilizations of the Americas, some with populations in the millions and sophisticated systems of government, art and science, were treated as if they simply didn't exist or had no legitimate claim to their ancestral homelands. The treaty's legacy lives on in unexpected ways. When nations today negotiate maritime boundaries or make claims on Antarctica or potential future claims on celestial bodies, they're engaging in a process that traces its lineage directly back to Tordesillas. The idea that nations can sit down and draw lines on maps to peacefully resolve competing territorial claims, however imperfect the implementation, was revolutionary for its time. Consider this fascinating modern parallel. In 1959, 12 nations signed the Antarctic Treaty, effectively dividing governance of an entire continent. While far more ethical than Tordesillas, the Antarctic Treaty explicitly protects the environment and prohibits military activity. It similarly involves powers making decisions about territories far from their shores. The legal framework we use to think about who owns what in international spaces still carries echoes of that 15th century agreement. Travel to the border between Brazil and its Spanish-speaking neighbors today, and you're literally standing on the legacy of Tordesillas. Though the actual border has shifted through centuries of negotiation, conflict, and settlement, its origins lie directly in that imaginary line. The treaty has left physical marks on our landscape that will likely endure as long as nations exist. Perhaps the most enduring legacy is linguistic and cultural. Walk the streets of Salvador in Brazil, then travel to Lima in Peru, and you'll experience 2 distinctly different cultural worlds, one shaped by Portuguese influence, the other by Spanish. These differences in language, architecture, music, cuisine, and countless cultural nuances can be traced back to which side of the Tordesillas line these regions fell on. The treaty didn't just divide land, it created cultural spheres that continue to define identities today. The Treaty of Tordesillas also offers us profound lessons about the limits of human foresight. When the negotiators were drawing their line across the Atlantic, they had no conception of the Pacific Ocean's vastness, the existence of Australia, or the complexity of the lands they were dividing. They were making decisions with severely limited information, a humbling reminder that even our most confident pronouncements about the future may look naive to later generations. This brings us to perhaps the most important question about the treaty's legacy. Was it just? By modern standards, the answer is clearly no. The treaty embodied a worldview that saw non-European peoples as having no legitimate rights to their own lands and resources. It enabled centuries of exploitation, cultural destruction, and in many cases, genocide. The casual arrogance with which two European powers divided the world between themselves represents a perspective we now recognize as deeply flawed, yet historical judgment requires nuance. The negotiators at Tordesillas were operating within the moral and intellectual framework of their time. They genuinely believed they were bringing Christianity and civilization to pagan lands, a mission they saw as beneficial rather than destructive. While this doesn't excuse the devastating consequences of colonization, it reminds us that future generations may judge our own certainties just as harshly. One little-known aspect of the treaty's legacy is how it influenced later independence movements. When Latin American countries fought for independence in the early 19th century, the borders they established often followed colonial boundaries that ultimately stemmed from Tordesillas. Revolutionary leaders like Simón Bolívar dreamed of a unified Spanish America that would transcend these colonial divisions, but the cultural and administrative realities created by centuries of separate development proved too powerful to overcome. The Treaty of Tordesillas also leaves us with uncomfortable questions about our present and future. Today, wealthy nations and powerful corporations make decisions about resource extraction, climate policy, and technological development that will affect people across the globe, often with limited input from those most affected. Are we repeating the pattern of Tordesillas when powerful entities make decisions for others without adequate representation? As humanity looks toward potential future colonization of Mars or extraction of resources from asteroids, the lessons of Tordesillas become even more relevant. Will we carry forward the same patterns of claiming and dividing, or can we develop more equitable and inclusive approaches to expanding into new frontiers? Perhaps the most valuable legacy of the Treaty of Tordesillas is as a historical mirror, one that reflects our human capacity for both remarkable diplomatic achievement and profound ethical failure. It shows us both what to emulate and what to avoid as we face our own global challenges. In studying this pivotal document, we're not just learning about the past, we're gaining insight into human nature itself and the eternal questions of power, justice, and coexistence that every generation must answer anew. As we've seen throughout this journey, the Treaty of Tordesillas was far more than just a line drawn on a map. It represented the power, ambition, and challenges of an era when the world was being rediscovered and redefined. This single document, signed in a small Spanish town over 5 centuries ago, set in motion forces that would reshape continents, transform cultures, and alter the course of countless lives across the globe. The audacity is almost breathtaking when you think about it. 2 relatively small European kingdoms, sitting at the western edge of their continent, decided they had the right to divide the entire planet between themselves. With the stroke of a pen, they claimed territories they hadn't even discovered yet, peoples they hadn't met, and resources they couldn't yet imagine. It was perhaps the boldest geopolitical move in human history. And yet, despite its fundamental injustice from a modern perspective, the treaty also represented something remarkable, a diplomatic solution to what could have been a devastating conflict. In an age when disputes between nations were typically settled through bloodshed, Portugal and Spain chose negotiation instead. They created a framework that, however flawed, attempted to establish rules for an orderly exploration of the unknown world. The treaty reminds us that human decisions, especially those made by the powerful, cast long shadows through history. When King John of Portugal and the Catholic monarchs of Spain reached their agreement in 1494, they couldn't possibly have foreseen how their decisions would shape language patterns, cultural identities, and national boundaries that persist into the 21st century. They couldn't have known that children in Brazil would speak Portuguese while their neighbors in Colombia would speak Spanish because of the line they drew. They couldn't have anticipated how their division would facilitate the rise of global empires, the transatlantic slave trade, or the decimation of indigenous civilizations. This sobering reality invites us to reflect on our own time. What decisions are we making today about technology, climate, resources, or governance that might have consequences echoing 5 centuries into the future? How might our descendants judge our choices, our priorities, and our blind spots? As we close this exploration of the Treaty of Tordesillas, I'd like to leave you with a fascinating question to ponder. What might our world look like today if Portugal and Spain had never signed this agreement? Perhaps other European powers would have established different colonial patterns. Perhaps indigenous resistance might have been more unified without the division between Portuguese and Spanish territories. Perhaps the linguistic and cultural map of the Americas would be unrecognizably different. Or perhaps similar patterns would have emerged through different means. History is full of these tantalizing what-ifs, counterfactual scenarios we can never truly know, but that help us appreciate the contingency of our present world. The reality we inhabit is just one of countless possible worlds that might have emerged from different choices, different agreements, different lines drawn on maps. What's certain is that the Treaty of Tordesillas stands as one of history's most consequential documents, a testament to human ambition, diplomatic innovation, cultural transformation, and also to the profound injustices that have shaped our world. In studying it, we gain insight not just into our past, but into the fundamental patterns of power, negotiation, and conflict that continue to define international relations today. If you've enjoyed this deep dive into one of history's most fascinating agreements, please hit that like button and share this video with friends who appreciate how seemingly distant history continues to shape our modern world. Subscribe to the Modern Age Chronicles channel for more explorations of pivotal moments that defined the early modern period and created the foundations of our contemporary global society. Your support helps us continue bringing these crucial historical stories to life. What other world-changing treaties or agreements would you like us to explore in future videos? Let us know in the comments below. Until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and remember that understanding our past is essential to navigating our future.